I believe the recording is going up.
I see that. All right, people are in the waiting room. They're joining. No worries. We're going to begin. I really appreciate everyone who was able to join us on time. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us to discuss guidance released on April 10th pertaining to YouthBuild AmeriCorps service during COVID-19. For those of you that do not know me, I am Matt Fisher. I'm the Senior Director for AmeriCorps at YouthBuild USA, and it's good to be with you today. I'm joined by the incredible AmeriCorps team, some of whom will be speaking with you today. Matt Clerico is monitoring the chat box. David is helping me with the Zoom. And Lauren Vermouth and Lauren Triano will be joining us during today's presentation. Hopefully we'll be providing you with some helpful information and answer questions that you may have related to service during COVID-19. Before we begin, I just want to say a few things. The first is I hope that you, your families, and all of your YouthBuild members are safe and healthy. I really hope that each one of you is able to find the time that you need to take care of yourselves personally as you continue to support the many young people that are enrolled at your programs. Secondly, I also want to express my gratitude for everything that you and your colleagues are doing to support one another and the young people at your programs, whether that's in person or from a distance during our current state of affairs. It has really been truly inspiring to see how the field is supporting one another, adapting to the situation, planning accordingly, and figuring out alternative ways to deliver training and support the young people during COVID-19. Special thanks to all those programs who have made it a point to reach out to their YouthBuild AmeriCorps portfolio manager who knows you at your program the best to help keep us informed of your program's current operations and to discuss ideas on how to best proceed in the future. Next slide, David, please. A couple of housekeeping items for our Zoom meeting. For the audio portion, we ask that you please join by computer or phone, not both. Please don't forget to keep yourself muted unless directed to do so otherwise. During our Q&A breaks, we may direct some of you to unmute yourself to ask your question in front of the larger group. And we do have a chat box. As always, if you have immediate questions during the meeting, please be sure to use the chat box and we'll field those questions as we move along. Next slide, David. The following is a listing of our agenda items we'll be discussing and answering questions about. As you can see, the majority of the meeting will be focused on offering clarity and context to the guidance our team sent out about the options for adjusted service, if it makes sense to at your program during COVID-19. Some of these options for adjusted service are going to be a departure from our approved AmeriCorps grant activities and may require pre-approval from YouthBuild USA or CNCS AmeriCorps before proceeding. So I'm going to provide a refresher as to what our members are already approved to do for AmeriCorps service under our approved grant with CNCS. Next slide, David. Before we dive into that content, I want to preface that while today's meeting may provide the program with ideas and options on how to adjust its AmeriCorps service, it needs to be noted that since every program operates within the local context, what might be presented as a possible option for one YouthBuild program may not be suitable for another. As always is the case, if the program would like to make any programmatic changes at any point during a grant cycle, the program's next required action is to discuss and explore those proposed changes with your portfolio manager first before proceeding. Next slide, David. In order to have a beneficial conversation about options for adjusted service, the following is what I consider a quick recap about YouthBuild USA's approved grant activities under AmeriCorps. Next slide. For all of you who are familiar with the Corporation for National Community Service, you know them as that grant-making federal agency that invests in programs and organizations that help to address some of America's greatest unmet community needs. Their largest program, AmeriCorps, makes investments to help expand program capacity through the addition of AmeriCorps service members to help address the following 6 areas. There is disaster services, economic opportunity, education, environmental stewardship, healthy futures, and veterans and military families. Since 2010, the activities of YouthBuild AmeriCorps have fallen under the economic opportunity focus area. More specifically, AmeriCorps knows YouthBuild as a program that engages opportunity youth in academic, leadership, and career skills training while they also spend some of their time serving their community through the building and repair of affordable housing. This is what the majority of YouthBuild AmeriCorps members do for service. However, over time, as programs have had to diversify their career skills training for its participants, YouthBuild USA, in partnership with many of you, have been able to turn those training tracks into approved AmeriCorps grant service. Service tracks that help bridge the digital divide, address community health and wellness needs, conservation and recycling, and for providing food service to low-income individuals. These are the approved service tracks that fall within the scope of YouthBuild USA's approved grant with CNCS. Next slide. At the subgrantee level, each program receives approval for the specific service tracks that their members can engage in during the grant year. These tracks are specifically listed in the program's subgrantee agreement, those that they are approved to do, and if the program would like to deviate from this, the program needs written permission before doing so. For each approved service track, programs are always required to have member position descriptions in place that include a listing of the specific activities members will engage in for service under that type of service position. The purpose of all this documentation is really to ensure us at YouthBuild USA and ultimately the folks at CNCS AmeriCorps that YouthBuild members are engaged in AmeriCorps service activities that speak to the program's approved service tracks, which ultimately fall within the scope of YouthBuild USA's approved grant with CNCS. Next slide, David. As our team tries to provide clarity around the possible ways AmeriCorps service can be adjusted during COVID-19, some of the options that CNCS is providing may be a departure from our approved grant activities. In any and all cases where a program wants to deviate from how they currently manage service at their program, please be sure to receive YouthBuild USA review and approval before doing so. Next slide, David. So before I hand things off to Senior Portfolio Manager Lauren Vermouth to provide clarity to the guidance released on options for adjusting AmeriCorps service during COVID-19, I want to pause here to see if there are any questions about the content I've just provided. Matt?
No questions in the chat box yet, but please put them in and we'll either call on you if we have time or I will address your questions for you.
Thank you, Matt. Yep, most of what I've said is probably a refresher, reflective of our usual grant application process and our request for applications from a year or so ago. So why don't I turn things over to you, Lauren?
Great. All right, next slide, David. So we're going to turn our attention to ways that we can adjust our service plans in light of COVID-19. And I'm going to present some information, and if questions arise as I'm speaking, please type those into the chat and we'll get them at our question break. Or if it's easier for you just to pay attention, listen, there will be time for you to ask those questions later. All right, next slide. Great. So what can we do during this crisis? There are really 4 options for programs to consider. And I want to start by saying that as time goes on, you may end up utilizing most or even all of these options that you're seeing listed on the screen. And your approach may need to change over time, and it may even need to be different for each member at your program. So I'm going to touch on each of these briefly right now, and then throughout this presentation, Lauren Troiano and I are going to look at the final 2 in greater depth. So first, what is our first option? It's really to continue to conduct your approved service activities while adhering to current federal, state, and local public health and safety guidelines. And so that just means that your members are continuing to conduct the service activities as they're written in their position description. For many programs, that is simply not a possibility, but for some it is. And those programs are doing that by reducing the number of crew members that are going out on site. They're providing PPE and taking those other precautions that are really necessary. But what if you can't do this? Our guidance is to suspend those members. If you can't perform those normal service activities, we really think suspensions are the best option. So you might be thinking, okay, my members can't serve, but they can be doing training during this time. There's training hours that are available. And while that might be true, typically training hours aren't hard to come by. And for some of your members, they may have already maxed out on those training hours that are available. And I think we can also discuss this idea of, are training hours valuable if you can't balance those with service opportunities? So from our perspective, simply having training hours available may not be a good enough reason to keep those members active. I also want to mention that suspensions are not a negative thing. They really are a tool to help us preserve a member's service term and give them the best chance to complete. So there's that. I just wanted to share kind of that perspective on training time. But also as a reminder that CNCS really expects us to suspend members if they cannot be accruing time. So this is potentially a compliance issue. Just wanted to remind everyone about that. And that's another reason that suspensions may be necessary. But let's say that you're in a situation where your community is allowing for people to leave their homes and there really is a need for members to answer that call to service. I still think that suspensions can be something that you can utilize. It'll create that time and that space for your program to explore those options and come up with a plan for creating new ways to perform safe, meaningful, and allowable service activities. And this work doesn't happen overnight. It's a really big deal to overhaul your program, and you're doing that right now. Everyone is being asked to fly the plane and the same time. So I think that suspensions can be a way to lessen that burden by taking AmeriCorps service out of the equation for a short period of time. So in summary, if you aren't having those opportunities for members to serve, then our guidance is to suspend. And then that will give you that time that you need to evaluate your next steps and at the same time preserving the most of that member service term that's possible. So now let's look at that third option there, adjusting service. As I said, I think this is something that people can do while members are suspended. And this includes the items that we shared in that earlier communication that Matt Fisher mentioned, which is teleservice, modified service, and alternative service. And we are going to dive deep on that in this webinar, and looking forward to answering your questions and providing clarity on that topic. And then the final option that's at our disposal here is exiting members due to COVID-19. COVID-19 certainly presents what we would consider a compelling personal circumstance, and an exit from service may make the most sense for some or even all of your members. And so we're going to touch on that topic later today. So those are our four options: continuing to conduct service, suspending members, adjusting service, and exiting members. And I think that there is a natural progression. That's why they're numbered there, but it may not be that way for everyone. So for some of you, you may need to move all the way to exiting members right away, but for others, you may kind of work through this list as time goes on. So let's go ahead and move on to adjust service. So David, if you can click forward, we'll talk a little bit about teleservice. So when we say teleservice, what we mean is that a grantee cannot continue its funded service activities in person. Members would move to performing approved activities through a remote means. And so for some of your members, that'll be the most straightforward way to keep them serving. So we'll be changing how they do their service rather than what they do. So an example would be a full-time member provides homework help to YouthBuild students using a virtual platform. So that image on the far right side, you have what's a full-time member maybe working through Google Classroom, or maybe they're in a Zoom meeting. They're interacting with students in a remote way, whereas before they would have been one-on-one or in small groups in the classroom. So just changing the way they perform their service would be an example of teleservice. Another example would be a member who usually was at a food bank or at the kitchen at their program, was preparing meals to share with people, low-income individuals. Now they're taking that and doing that service in their home. So again, the same type of service, but doing it in a new way. So CNCS has some guidance around teleservice. This guidance memos existed for a while, so it's not new. And in that, they state that members should generally be providing service directly to the people in the communities where they serve, rather than performing service remotely. Therefore, teleservice should be rare, if ever, and involve appropriate documentation, supervision, and oversight. So COVID-19 certainly presents a scenario where teleservice would be appropriate. But I want to make it clear that this is temporary, that we're really talking about teleservice as being within the context of COVID-19 and not as a permanent shift in the way that you operate your program. So also on this slide, you're seeing listed some required actions. based on that guidance that I was just reading from that guidance memo, we need to have some required actions before anyone engages in teleservice with their members. And what that would be is working with your portfolio manager to develop a written policy and procedure and have that approved in advance. So David, if you'll click over to the next slide, we'll look at what that would involve. All right, so this again is set by CNCS, and there's two main components that we're trying to address in our policy. First, how are we going to provide meaningful supervision when we're not face-to-face with our members anymore? And also, how are we going to figure out how we're going to verify independently the hours that are being served? So finding a way to move beyond just getting a list from the member of this is what I did and this is how many hours I served, but how can we independently verify that through our supervision practices? So David, if you'll click one more. These are the items that CNCS says need to be in a policy. So we're providing written authorization of teleservice in advance. We're being very specific about the communication requirements between the member and the supervisor. Are you checking in once a day? Is it twice a day? Are you having a formal supervision meeting weekly? Those types of things. And then you're also addressing how you're going to deal with this increased risk of time and attendance abuse. So what are your strategies for overcoming that? And then as the supervisor, how are you going to validate and approve those hours? We've had some programs that have already gone through this process and they've been able to figure it out. They have policies in place and they're implementing it right now. So your portfolio manager can certainly work with you. We have a template to help you get started. But as a reminder, we want to go through this work together and have a policy in place before you would start the teleservice with your members. All right. Thanks, David. So in addition to teleservice, there are two other ways that you could adjust service during COVID-19. And I do want to mention that these are potentially an overlay with teleservice because teleservice is really more focused on how rather than the what of service. So modified service. Members perform activities that are not listed in their approved position description, but are within the scope of the program's approved grant application. So Matt Fisher shared at the beginning of our presentation really what is within our approved grant. And then alternative service, that's where members are performing activities that are outside of the program's approved grant application with YouthBuild USA. So as we move into our next slides, I'm going to talk more about those distinctions and why they matter. But I want it to be clear that during COVID-19, there is an opportunity to adjust service to activities that aren't just in your position description, and maybe even to those outside of our grant. CNCS is providing maximum flexibility to allow members to meet needs in their communities and to complete their service terms. But there are some requirements, and we want to make sure that those are clear. All right, thanks, David. So modified service, we just learned that that has, when members are doing activities within the scope of the grant, but weren't previously listed on their position description. I think that the most common example that we're seeing right now would be members who are maybe sorting or distributing food from a food pantry or another nonprofit partner. So let's say you have a health and wellness member that is now doing that. It wasn't what they originally signed up to do. It wasn't on their position description, but it is within the scope of our grant. We have other members in our grant who would be providing food to low-income individuals. So that's what would make it a modified service activity. And what do you need to do if you want to make this part of your plan? It's actually very simple. You're going to write that down and share it with your portfolio manager. We're really just looking for a written list of those activities that you plan to engage in. This is what CNCS has requested us to do. And so it's really as simple as that. It's just being in touch with your portfolio manager about those new activities. All right, next. Thanks, David. So alternative service, we learned that that means doing those service activities that are outside of the scope of our grant. And we do not expect you to be an expert in that. And that's our role at YouthBuild USA, to help you determine what activities are modified versus alternative. So here's an example that we are seeing in the field. A construction member is assembling PPE for frontline workers. This is important and valuable service, but our grant doesn't directly connect to this type of service. We do health and wellness work, we're in that space, but our focus is not on producing materials. So in that case, we would need to follow through on this required action. And what that would be is to work with your portfolio manager again, to come up with a detailed description of what that activity would be. And then YouthBuild USA will take it to our program officer or portfolio manager, changed the term there, at CNCS to get their written approval before you can start those activities. So we have heard some trepidation, some concerns from the field about elevating things up to CNCS. And I want to share that CNCS is eager to provide these options and flexibilities to programs so that they can serve their members and communities. There are partners in this. Really what they're asking us to do is to keep them in the loop. They're not trying to stand in our way here. So your portfolio manager will work with you on this to establish that clear description of activities before it's elevated to CNCS for their final approval. All right, next slide, David. Thank you. So in addition to those activities that I've already mentioned on previous slides, I just wanted to take a second to share some more examples because I think we're all looking to learn from each other during this time. So these are a few activities that are already taking place or in the planning phase across the YouthBuild network. So we're hearing about members that are serving at call center for a city or county emergency management hotline. Other members are assisting in establishing auxiliary space at hospitals. We have members that are providing support services at emergency shelters. Other members are building bat houses and bird houses and brochure display cases for city parks. They're able to do that at their own home. We are seeing other members involved in logistics support for the Office of Emergency Management. So these are not like a pre-approved list. Again, you'll need to think about it within your local context, as Matt Fisher shared earlier, but just some ideas of how other members or other programs are adjusting service during COVID-19. All right, David. Next slide. Thank you. And actually, you just go ahead and click through, I think 3 more times. Thanks. All right. So I am almost wrapped up here. So please feel free to add in those questions. But I did want to share a few more reminders as you're thinking through those ways that you might adjust service. The first is just to reiterate, there are no blanket approvals. So if you see or hear stories about something that other programs are doing, it doesn't mean that you are approved to do it as well. All alternative activities have to be approved by CNCS, and your portfolio manager needs to be aware of all of those new activities that you're going to be taking place in. And the next thing is, I think, goes without saying. Of course it does. Prioritizing the protection and the health and safety of members. But what I do want to share is that as you may need to begin providing additional training, PPE or other things to keep your members safe, that's something that you could be charging to the AmeriCorps grant, assuming that they're RAD. So your financial manager can be your partner in talking through that as you're looking to maybe add some new items maybe to your budget. They can work with you to determine if that's necessary. But as you're looking to protect your members, do think about ways that you might be able to utilize the grant to make that possible. And then finally, just a reminder that compliance is your responsibility. You know, at YouthBuild USA, we only know what you share with us, and likewise to CNCS. So they've been very clear that while they do want to sign off and give approval for all these new activities, it could be determined at a later date that those activities were not compliant. So it's a general reminder to keep in focus that all those activities, restrictions that we've talked about in the past, prohibited activities, etc. All of those things are still in place. So that's just one more thing to keep in mind as we look to alter our service during COVID-19. So our goal for this this webinar is really to hear from you and provide an opportunity to answer your questions. So that is the extent of the information I wanted to share on this topic. So now we're gonna turn it over to all of you in the chat to go through some of your questions. If it's easier for you to just raise your hand, Matt Clerico can unmute you, and then you can let us know which one it is and we can try to address it.
Yeah, I can try. So only one question so far in the chat box, but it has to deal with exits. And I think we will definitely cover the answer to Rachel's question Sorry for misspelling your name in the chat. But yeah, I think people are still kind of digesting everything you just presented, Lauren. I don't see any hands up, but you know, people could certainly ask questions about this section later in the presentation. So maybe we should move on.
All right, sounds good.
All right.
Yeah, I think, David, you can move forward one slide.
Okay, so yeah, so I'll cover this next section, and then if people are thinking of questions, we can just collect all of the questions at the end. So I'm going to be speaking to the final option that Lauren mentioned earlier in the webinar by introducing some new information regarding exiting members due to COVID-19 closures and disruptions. So David, if you want to go to the next slide. So we shared this in our last webinar, but I want to reiterate that in addition to normal compelling personal circumstance rules, the CARES Act is going to allow members whose service is disrupted by COVID-19 to earn a full education award if they have served more than 50%, half of their hours. And now, as you can see in the graphic here, in line with normal compelling personal circumstance rules, those whose service was disrupted by COVID-19 but have earned less than 15% of hours are still not eligible for an education award. Those who earned above 15% but under 50% can earn a partial education award. So those rules essentially remain the same. The new item here is that members who earn more than 50% of their hours can earn a full education award rather than the partial education award. And as you probably guessed, with this new opportunity comes some new requirements. So David, if you want to go to the next. So there's actually a fair amount of information to cover related to these exits. And what we decided is that we're going to host a separate webinar to give this topic the time and attention that we think it needs and deserves. So as you can see on your screen, there will be another webinar, a lot like today's, on May 4th. And links and registration information will be coming to you soon for that. During that webinar, we will be covering forms that you're going to need to use, the timeline for reporting these exits to YouthBuild USA, because yes, that'll be a new requirement. CNCS is requiring that you report to your prime grantee, who's us, all of the early exits that you are going to be doing due to COVID-19. And the process for actually exiting the members in eGrants, because there will be some different new procedures for how to administer these exits in eGrants. So for the time being, what we're asking is that programs do not exit any members right now. And there's a few reasons we're saying that. First, we want to have the time to train everyone on these new procedures. And we are still formalizing those new procedures. It's what we're going to present to you on May 4th. Second, we want to make sure that programs have had time to process the impact that exiting members will have on spending down your grant. And we will certainly be covering that part of this topic in the webinar on May 4th as well. Third, we don't know what other changes may come our way. And so we are creating space to allow CNCS to provide more guidance that could help our members. So if your members are due or overdue for an exit and you feel like you can't wait, please get in touch with your portfolio manager. Right now, again, we're asking you, please do not exit any members, but if you have specific questions about this, get in touch with your portfolio manager. And that really brings me to the next slide, which is we want to remind you of our main takeaway from all of this information, which is to be in touch with your portfolio manager to discuss all of these new options that we're presenting to you. Mallory said the other day in one of our meetings, 2 weeks in COVID-19 is like a regular 2 months. And that's so true. So you may need to be in more regular contact with your portfolio manager than you're used to being in more normal times. So we're going to stay on the line certainly right now. Hopefully you've had some time to think of some questions that are on your mind about everything we've presented. I think the next slide is just another question slide. So I don't know if this generated more questions in the chat box, Matt.
Yeah, a couple. So to earn an award after the COVID interruption, does the percentage of training time requirements remain the same?
Yes, as of
Yes.
now. Sorry.
No,
So
you go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, so as of now, that regulation hasn't changed. The percentage is still no more than 20% of training is required at exit. But one of the reasons why we've asked programs not to move forward with exiting right away is that we know that CNCS is trying to provide maximum flexibility, and there might be changes that may be favorable to our members and their service time. So that's partly why we are asking programs to pause and see what other opportunities may present themselves as CNCS explores those options moving forward.
And again, this isn't the time to exit anyone, but if you wanted to try to, maybe do an inventory of where your members are at and, to see who's gotten to 50%, again, using that exit helper in our member hour log tool will let you know exactly how many education hours or training hours are allowed, depending on how many service hours they've accomplished to this point. So yeah, that could help. But again, these requirements may change. Other requirements are changing too. So we're just holding off for now. Let's see. If someone was suspended prior to COVID, would they still be eligible for this benefit, this, altered exit as well? My answer would be if your program is closed because of local, health considerations, then, it would apply to many. Anybody have any thoughts about that?
I think that's a great question to bring up with your portfolio manager to get additional context regarding the situation and whether it makes sense to exit them utilizing COVID-19 opportunities.
Matt Fisher, are we planning to have a mass exit date for the network?
A mass exit date? I am not planning at this time. And I'm not sure who's asking that question, but I'd be interested to hear if other organizations are doing that or what the benefit of having one of those would be. But we are not planning on any sort of mass exit date at this point regarding this.
Okay. Yeah. Again, like Lauren said, there's different situations depending on different localities. So we're certainly not going to tell everybody to do the same thing across the country. Just to be clear, everyone who is within their 1 year of service is eligible for the COVID-19 Exit Education Award. So anybody who's active now that may need to be exited, they would be eligible for this special exit?
So there's nothing specific in the guidelines saying anything about the length of the member service term. So that opportunity may be available to anyone who is enrolled in this grant cycle.
That's my understanding as well. Assuming that we are able to restart programming and enroll new members over the summer, will this be true for those members as well? Or is this a one-time deal?
Right now, CNCS and their guidance hasn't listed anything specific to grant years. It just says members who are unable to serve during COVID-19. As CNCS provides more specificity around any of their guidance, we would provide that. If it's applicable to just certain members of a grant year, of course, we would make sure that that information is available to you all.
Right. And I think that answers the final question we have is that, does it matter if they were in the 2018-19 grant year or the current grant year? I think the first question was more like, if we shut down now, exit everyone out for this special occurrence, could we enroll again this summer and do it again? And I personally think you would have a hard time explaining how you were shut down and still enrolling members. So that would be a pretty specific question for your portfolio manager.
Yep, that sounds like a great scenario to bring up with your portfolio manager, as it is applicable to the local context to figure out the larger context, to understanding what you're trying to do, and to see and put forth a plan that makes the most sense for your members and program operations.
So for programs that haven't suspended yet, Lauren, can you remind people of what our window for doing suspensions is?
Absolutely, Matt. So the rule is that the suspension needs to be recorded in e-grants within 30 days of when the action took place in real life. So if you have a member that hasn't been serving, they haven't been accruing hours for 30 days, you want to make sure and get that suspension recorded in e-grants right away. Matt, does that answer the question?
That's what I was wondering. So Rachel Russell would like to unmute and ask her questions. You can unmute yourself, Rachel, just using the button on the lower hand. There you go. I unmuted you as well.
Welcome, Rachel. What's your question?
So I was the one that asked the exit map. I wanted to go back to my question because I don't think it was very clear. So underneath your direction, you just mentioned that you didn't want anyone to exit anyone. And so I guess the bigger question is like, when will we know, because we all know we are in different locations, when it's okay to start exiting members again? Did you hear me?
Yep, I'm sorry. So I think honestly, Rachel, I think the best is to talk to your portfolio manager. Have you talked to your portfolio manager about a plan in place regarding exiting?
No, I haven't. And I was planning to listen to this first before going back to it. Going back to her. Lauren's my portfolio manager. But I think I was just trying to get clarity because you said there was going to be a May 4th webinar, and then I guess just trying to figure out when is the good time. I don't want to overload. Yeah. I also know that we have members that would qualify for this special opportunity, but then we also have folks that we're kind of losing in the wind, and they're kind of sitting there, and it goes against our suspension protocol, which is like after 60 days, which they already were almost there anyway before this started. So just trying to find like a good, you just don't want people sitting out there and then it just becomes a pile of work for me when this is all over, if I'm being truthfully honest, if I wait to exit everyone until the very end.
Right. You want to do you want to figure out what's going to be best for your members in the current situation and time. So I think to make use, it's hard for me to give a flat out response. There's more context that will be needed because of your enrollment cycle, number of members, number of hours. All of those things are variables that are worth discussing to understand, to give a very clear answer as to what would be best for your program. I know Lauren is more than happy to discuss with you what makes sense. And she, by all means, has made herself available to all of her programs to help answer those specific questions.
Yeah. And Rachel, I'll reach out directly after this. And I think what Lauren Troiano was saying, for those that can wait, we're asking you to wait until May 4th, where we're able to provide that training and we'll be able to release those tools that you're going to need. But if you're in a position where you can't wait, definitely be in touch, pester your portfolio manager, work with us to get the answer that you need. Because Rachel brought up a great point that you may have a policy in place that requires you to take action. And we want you to maintain we want you to stay with those policies to the extent possible. So thank you very much for raising that.
I also want to be clear that, there are programs exiting members because they finish their hours, right? Like we're talking about these strange exits, this new opportunity. If somebody's complete, they need to be closed out anyways. So some programs have new cohorts that are going to start in May. Are they able to enroll and then capture training hours? I mean, again, this is a specific situation. I definitely have some programs in my group that are moving forward because of where they are in the country. So I think, again, it's hard to make blanket answers for that. I think we'll just have to work that out one-on-one. But this is the question I'll throw out to the rest of the group here. So do we have a tentative plan in case, again, programs reopen this summer and then have to close again later because of COVID, like another wave. And that's certainly a consideration. Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, at our May 4th webinar, we're going to get into the reasons that we can connect COVID-19 to an exit. And so CNCS has listed out some items, and we'll go through those one by one. But again, it's can we connect the dot to how COVID-19 has prevented our members from completing their service? So that may be true now, and there could be a period where it isn't, and then it could come back again. And so I think CNCS is trying to be flexible, provide the support and resources that we need. And so again, your portfolio manager will walk through that with you one-on-one as it needs to happen, and we'll provide more guidance in 2 weeks.
Lauren, when we go to suspend our members, should we use the last day that the member served or the date the program was officially shut down?
It's a good question, and maybe it could be different depending on the scenario, but I don't know. I don't know, guys, what are you thinking? I can see a case for either one.
I mean, as a general rule, the suspension should be the last day the member earned hours. So, I mean, that's the standard guidance. So I don't think that this situation changes that.
All right. Thank you, David. Yeah, again, it's going to, we can have those individual conversations because, there may be some weird situations. It all depends on what kind of documentation you're putting on that suspension form too. Like if you're doing a blanket suspension for COVID-19 and because, your sponsoring agency shut down, maybe that makes a little more sense, but yeah, we'd have to talk about that individually. Okay. Not seeing any more questions, but again, as I've been telling people in the crash course all week or all month, we are very available. So yeah, shoot your questions to your portfolio managers because we're all grounded.
Just one more thing I wanted to bring up because it came up was this idea of folks who are not suspended but who are still earning training hours. So if you are recording those training hours, that would still require a teleservice policy because those are AmeriCorps hours and it falls under the guidance that we need clear understanding of the supervision that's happening and how those hours are being verified. So I think we were less focused on the training hours because we're feeling that, those other ways are going to be accrued. But if you have members who are active and you are recording those hours, then you do need a teleservice policy in place to capture those training hours.
Okay, so there's been another question. So we should exit those who are ready because they completed their hours or maybe partial completion with employment. So again, if it's business as usual, I think you can exit your members, certainly. As far as the ones that are kind of in limbo now because of COVID-19, those are the ones we're asking you to hold off on. Again, because this situation is changing, may even change by the end of this week. So, certainly we may know something new by May 4th. So it's those members that are in limbo now that we're asking you to just hold off on. You can keep someone suspended for quite some time. So there's no reason to move right away.
Matt, I just want to add, I was just reading Tamika's question. If it is somebody with only partial hours, please don't exit them yet because based on the number of hours they have, they could get a full award now, whereas maybe you were just going to give them a partial award. So if it looks like that was part of your question, maybe you were going to exit somebody for employment early, definitely hold off on that exit or talk to your portfolio manager.
Good point, LT. Nice job. All right, those are all the questions I see. Johnny's trying to join.
Very good. Well, we want to thank everyone for their time today, for your questions, for just processing this information that we're presenting to you, and for working with your YouthBuild AmeriCorps portfolio manager or fiscal manager regarding programmatic or fiscal changes during COVID-19. We will be sending out a link today's presentation of the recording. If there's colleagues or there's pieces that you missed, you want to share that, you can go so right ahead. And we'll be sending out information about our May 4th webinar to provide specific guidance on how we'd like folks to exit their members during COVID-19 so we can be in compliance with reporting requirements. As always, we want to thank you for your time and your dedication to supporting your young people, especially now during this time. If you have questions, don't be afraid to reach out, and be well. We hope to engage with you again soon. Take care.